Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session today. We're going to be talking to you about preventing failure, how to leverage people and technology to mitigate common FDA audit findings. So lots about documentation. So I'm Heather DiFrusicia, the Associate Director of RTSM IWRS here at Axiom Real-Time Metrics. And today I have with me Brian Dempster, our Senior Director, Global Clinical Management. So welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Heather.
And so many times when you're working on a study, you might have data in separate systems. So you can see maybe your eTMF, your CPM tracking in another system, EDC. And what that means is you don't have central access to your key data. That can present challenges for your data review, as well as when you're making decisions. So what we do here at Axiom is we drive collaboration via that real-time actionable data. And how do we do that? We do that with our Fusion eClinical suite. And that has everything from EDC, data management, of course, randomization and trial supply management, the CPMS, which includes eTMF, which we'll focus on today, as well as your patient-reported outcomes. So again, we're going to be talking about common FDA audit findings. And when we're looking through the audit findings, there's a lot about documentation. So whether it's lack of documentation, the documentation is not contemporaneous, or there's a lack of a documented process. And so what we're talking about today is that failure to prepare really is preparing to fail. And Brian, I'll let you take it from there.
Thanks so much, Heather. So yeah, failing to prepare is exactly that, preparing to fail. And why is that? Because documentation specifically plays a part in this, because it's often an afterthought when studies are set up. Everybody gets everything ready, but you don't think about the type of documentation that you're actually going to start collecting. You think it will take care of itself because when it arrives, you'll just keep the documentation. The problems that arise from that is that you end up with no structure to your documentation, and you're also unaware of what you might not have or what you have that is in fact excess to what you actually need. So a clear plan at the outset of the study is super important. The average life cycle of a traditional study documentation collection looks something like this. So there's a lot of activity at the beginning of the study, which is to be expected, and a lot of documentation is generated and filed in the TMF. And then as the study goes along, the onus on documentation is less pronounced, and people kind of get busy with the actual product of the study and forget to actually begin to document those things as they go along. As we come to the inspection end of the study, the completion end, we start to think about inspections and what we're going to do to show the inspector the progress of the study, and then documents are collected in earnest at the end of the study. What's the problem with doing that? Well, what you actually want to see is something like this. Thanks. You want to see something like this, which is documents that are collected on an ongoing basis through the study when you know and expect them to come in. And that really gives a contemporary feel to the documentation of your study. And contemporary feel to the study documentation is super important. And let me talk a little bit about why that is. Okay, so everybody in the audience, if you think about what you were doing at 9 a.m. this morning, that's a pretty easy thing to recall, and you could probably recall it with a great deal of accuracy and be able to illustrate that to somebody who is asking that question. But if you think about what you were doing at 9 a.m. on this day 4 years ago, that's probably harder to recall, and if you can, you're probably less certain about the accuracy of your recall of that event. And it's exactly the same for clinical trials. Documents that are loaded at the back end of the study, when all of those activities that they're documenting have actually already occurred, can't possibly be seen as having the same level of quality and accuracy as a document that was actually uploaded in the time frame that the activity that it's documenting was undertaken. So if we start with the end in mind, which means when we're thinking about why we're collecting this documentation and being able to show an inspector that we have conducted the study in the manner with which we are claiming, then we start to think about how we need to document all of the activities of the study throughout. To do that, we need to start thinking about what kind of documentation we want to collect, the process for collecting that documentation, and the process for storing it and providing evidence that we did those things in a contemporary fashion. So let's talk a little bit about what documentation is. The Code of Federal Regulations has a rather lengthy, as you can see here, description of documentation, but really what we want to think about and concentrate on for the purpose of this discussion is what that documentation does for us. And we want to be able to show to regulators and any other inspectors in the study that we can reconstruct the trial activities, and we can show in an inspection that we were in compliance with regulatory requirements throughout the life cycle of the entire study. So in order to do that, we have many tools at our disposal that are already out there. We should plan at the beginning of the study to put these tools in play. The reference model, the TMF reference model, every study should really begin with a TMF reference model mapped out. So we take the reference model and then decide how you're going to map that model to the requirements of your individual study. That map then can be translated down to who is responsible for providing which documents and when those people are responsible for which documents. And this is really important because this begins to bring the documents, the people and process and technology into the documentation of a clinical study. It's not just about paper and artifacts, it's actually about who collects those artifacts, when they're collected, and where they're going to be put. So again, the TMF will define those key documents that are needed, who's going to collect them, when they're going to be collected. So these are key milestones in that timing piece that you want to be thinking about when you're mapping from the trial master file. So study go live, the country approval, site activations, monitor visits, all of these are key milestones that you would expect to generate documents and specific documents within your study. And you should be looking at those milestones occur throughout your study, where the documents collected and where they submitted to the TMF. Again, in order to know whether those documents were collected, you need to have a process of review. And it's the frequency of that review that, again, is really important. This needs to be specified in your plan. If you set out a process at the beginning, but then you rely on only checking it at the end, you have no idea whether you stayed on track throughout the course of the study. And so it's very important to build into your plan and hold those accountable for meeting the aspect of the plan of checking regularly the documentation of those milestones, that's done. So another important part of this is the people, and this is part of the process where you collect those documents and check that they're collected, and also, of course, check the quality of the documents as they're going in as well.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the technology and people here. So starting with the people side, as Brian had noted earlier, the goal is to have dedicated teams. It's essential to have that understanding of the importance of documentation, and that's for the study team, as well as upper management. And upper management is, of course, how we're going to get those dedicated teams built into our budget. We also need to make sure that everyone's on board, so we're sticking to that defined review schedule, escalating when things aren't happening as expected. And of course, all of this means that you'll be able to deliver a quality product. On the technology side, we're really taking what Brian had detailed out in those considerations in the plan and translating that. So we're selecting the standard or study-specific versions of the workflow. What is that status workflow, as you can see here? Are there specific folder permissions required for who? And that's based on your contributors, as well as who needs to receive notifications when activities are completed or if they're stale. The metadata, so the date and time and modified by, of course, are standard, the file types, file sizes, expiry dates, and the list goes on. We also want to be able to monitor that performance. So how do we do that? We're monitoring the eTMF health. So when was it expected? Are we meeting those based on the milestones that have been met? Do we have those documents, those artifacts? And if we have upcoming expiry dates, again, those reminders to make sure that we have those updated documents coming through. The required statuses, again, going back to what the study-specific or standard workflow is. And of course, having the real-time reporting and metrics, which gives you the visibility that you need. When we're looking at that traditional TMF, a paper TMF, then does everyone have accessibility to the same documents, the controlled access to the documents? Is it searchable? Do we have that real-time audit trail through your metadata? And the list goes on here as well. But as you can see, that it's not available on the paper side, that is available in the eTMF. And of course, the benefits really come from making sure that we're following that TMF plan. So we're going to take what we talked about earlier and we're going to go through a little bit of a case study. So this is on IP and trial supply documentation. So we're going to select our reference model. So we're going to use the latest and greatest, the DIA reference model version from the beginning of March. And the great thing about that model is that it also includes that TMF map, and we can then update based on the applicable study documents and the availability, just going back, jumping ahead actually to our milestones. And additionally, for our plan, we need to define our roles and responsibilities. So the sponsor's doing what, the CRO's doing this, the depot, the monitors, where is that information coming when it comes to the IP and trial supplies? We've just highlighted a few of the items here. So we have our artifacts or our document types. So for example, our IP supply plan and our IP sample labels, that's coming from our sponsor or CRO or depot. So we want to define which contributors are providing what. And of course, we're expecting all of those to be available and they should be filed prior to study go live. From there, we have some items that are applicable at the regulatory approval per country. So your pharmacy manual, your QP release, batch records. And then at site activation, we want to make sure we have the confirmation of authorization to ship. And then when we're looking at our monitoring visits, then our interim monitoring visits, we should have our temperature monitoring logs. And then at the closeout visits, we have noted our IP accountability and IP shipment documentation. And we have just noted an asterisk here, and that's because inventory management systems, having that electronic documentation means that you might be able to support single exports at the end of study versus having to have that as part of your artifacts for your IMVs because you need those ongoing uploads. So just a little bit about what that technology brings. So on the clinical trial material tracking side, everything from your program-wide inventory, your investigational product, and as well as ancillary supplies, going down to the depot details, the site, and all the way to the accountability. And that, of course, is at the subject level and the site and final disposition. So what you can see there is other modules can also simplify the documentation plan. It's giving you centralized data, so it's giving you that visibility, just like we talked about on the eTMF side. It's giving you the traceability via the audit log, and of course, having those notifications and reminders means that that can push and make sure that everyone's aware of what is pending or stale. Along with that comes the reports and dashboards to be able to monitor your performance. And of course, as I mentioned, you also can have those end of study outputs, which means that you have that efficiency built in. So as we noted earlier at Axiom, we have our Fusion eClinical suite, and it acts as a connected hub for your study data. It includes, just as we noted, the modules that can really benefit here on the eTMF side, as well as the clinical trial material tracking. But as you can see, there's all of your other buckets are covered as well. And this is all through a single logon. You can really pick and choose what you need for your particular study. And as you can see here, you can pick just particular modules. You can have the EDC plus those selected modules, or you can have the full benefits from utilizing the complete Fusion suite. Just like we have on the technology side, we also can kind of pick and choose what services make sense. And so when we're talking about that dedicated study team, that falls within our clinical management group that Brian leads. When we're talking about the data and really being able to focus on the data because you have the technology and the people that you need, then that means that you have the 24/7 access. You have your unified EDC, as we noted, along with your inventory, your reporting. It really means that you can own that data. You have access to your data. You don't have to get that through another party. And because you have access to the data, then it means that you have the awareness and the ability to action it. So why Axiom? We really are committed to your study success. We're bringing that technology, we're bringing the team, and that all comes together. So we don't want to have this situation where the inspectors arrive and you're really not ready to show them in. But as Brian noted earlier, we want to make sure that we have that ideal life cycle that at the end of the study we can look back on, and of course throughout the study, that we had the documentation that we needed, when we needed it, from who we needed it from. So on that note, I just want to thank everyone, and we're looking forward to your questions. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out on our email address here and request a demo. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again for joining our session today. We will be starting off with a poll question. So if you haven't already voted, please do. You have a poll button at the bottom of your screen, and then you can answer. So our question today is, do your documentation SOPs currently require a TMF plan? And it's just a simple yes or no, and clicking the vote button. So we'll just take a peek at the results right now. Okay, so far it looks like we have quite a few yeses here. So right now it is 100%. So Brian, we should be happy with this. Monitor to see how that goes, but yes, it looks like it's 100%. So that's excellent news. So go ahead.
I think so. I think I'm not wholly surprised by that, Heather. Actually, I think there's been a massive focus on TMF and the preparedness of TMF during inspections, and we spoke to that during the presentation, talking about, you know, this is the #1 finding in FDA audits, and so it's not entirely surprising that the industry is now kind of catching on to this, perhaps somewhat belatedly, but it's good that we're getting there, and really good to see actually that people are putting their plans in place and having those in their SOPs. I think the next question to raise for us as an industry is, what is the quality of those plans? And are they preventing the kind of findings that we were seeing that resulted in them being put in place in the first place?
Absolutely. And so just switching into our first question in the chat group here. So what are the challenges in transitioning from paper to an eTMF? Brian?
Yeah, so this is something I think that is becoming less of an issue as eTMF becomes the gold standard for TMFs, it used to be. But of course, by virtue of the fact that studies are many years long, we still have a lot of paper TMFs out there, and transitioning is something that I think people should think about. There are many challenges to it, and I've been through this process several times. The challenges, though, tend to be not the logistical ones that people think about, you know, oh, I've got 4,000 documents and I have to move these from paper to electronic. That process is actually pretty straightforward now with modern scanning techniques and that kind of thing. It's actually the validation piece that goes alongside of that presents the major challenges and the major findings for people who do this when they get to audit time. So once the documents are placed in the electronic file, did they bring the metadata with them that association with the contemporaneous factor can be proven, the ownership of those documents, can that be proven as well? I think that's something that really has to be thought of. And again, this speaks to the point of planning. You know, if you're going to transition your paper TMF to electronic TMF, then you really need to think about how you're going to plan to do that. What kind of process you're going to follow. Is that process documented? Can you then go back and demonstrate that the process was documented, and did you ensure the quality was matched when you present the electronic files? to the auditors at the end of the study. And I think one thing that has to be really thought out carefully as well is what you then plan to do with the paper once you have the transition completed. Because the last thing in the world that you want to find yourself with is two effective TMFs, the study of paper TMF and an electronic TMF. You really want to get to a point where you can say, this is my TMF now, and you have a destruction mechanism for the paper that the electronic is now actually representing. Without that, you bring in the possibility of inconsistencies and other problems. So that's something that many plans leave out, and it has to be really carefully thought about.
Absolutely. So just looking at our next question, so still on that kind of line of thought, but when you are working with the TMF, then what about those documents that are stored or owned by other vendors? What's the approach to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, that brings into play one of the key things that has to be realized, I think, at the outset of the TMF and represented in the plan, that the TMF is not what many of the previous generation of clinical researchers, and I count myself amongst that aging group now, which is a filing cabinet in a room somewhere with documents. The TMF is a representation of the actual activities of the study, and that was talked about in the presentation as well, actually, from the CFR definition. And that means that you also have to think about where activities are being undertaken with vendors and what they're doing to document those activities. And do you have a documented representation of those activities? So the TMF is not a single location entity. It can be spread over many different places, both real and virtual, and you have to have that marked in your plan right at the outset to say, these are the documents that we will expect to see, these are the people who are responsible, these are the groups that are responsible for these documents, and also a checking mechanism to make sure that those documents are created and filed at the time of the milestone that you expect. So bringing your vendors into your TMF planning is critically important, and also making sure that there's clarity between you and your vendors as to what should be collected and expected. And also, the last point on that, I think, is that you should have regular transfers set up of those documents to a location where you can view them and store them, because what you don't want to do is find at the end of the study you go back to a vendor, and there are horror stories out there of this. They say, can we have all of these things now? You're collecting them, and it says, oh, I had no idea you expected those from me. We never file that kind of documentation. So I think it's really important that when you're writing your TMF plan, that your vendors are not only thought about, but also involved and recognize their responsibilities within that plan.
Absolutely. Okay, our next question. What modules have the biggest impact from a documentation standpoint? And this one I can definitely take. So one of those big ones, which we did talk about today, is of course the CPM Tracking module. What is it doing along with all modules? They're centralizing the data. This is a particularly tricky one as you're sending that IP or devices to potentially global sites. And so you want to have, and you need to have, that awareness and visibility at all levels, the study level, the site level, and of course the dispensing and use for the individual subjects. Using those modules means that you also have that traceability, the audit log, and a big part, as we mentioned today as well, is the stale or pending actions that can be monitored and notifications that can go out on those. So it's not just the awareness, but it's also when those responsible parties are aware, then they will also be acting on, and you can follow up appropriately. So that goes back into that timely side of the documentation, and really minimizing the amount of pending actions or reconciliation required at the end of the study. Your reports, your dashboards, of course, that ties back to the visibility and allows you to continue to monitor performance. and the end of study outputs that we talked about as well. As Brian noted, when we're talking about the TMF, it's not a single location. So again, using that map, identifying your milestones for each of the items, who were the responsible parties, and making sure you have that information at the end of study. Just going back to modules, so we talked about CPM tracking. I would also include safety in that. Again, safety is a big one that can require a lot of different parties and a reconciliation often at the end. But when you're utilizing a unified platform, you don't need that reconciliation. You have that traceability, that data entry is in one place. And when we're talking about the different parties, there's the narratives. When you're looking at the case narratives, there's the any additional safety assessments, and again, the actual reporting, and this time not just being able to report and look at the data, but the actual reporting going out to the authorities. Our last one, I'll keep it to that because I would say every module is important, but e-consent, e-source, e-pro, that full bucket, I think, is very important because we're removing that paper aspect. So that's really changing the documentation and the expectations at the end of study because we're removing that extra piece. It's already directly documented with all of the metadata. I'll leave it there. For our last question, what kinds of end user support and/or resources are available for the eTMF? And this one, I'll start with you, Brian.
Thank you. So I think it would be remiss of me at any point not to mention the TMF group, which I run 2 summits actually each year, one in Europe, one here in the US. And that really is a phenomenal industry resource. It's run completely by people from within the industry. They really drive the TMF updates, and they are responsible, of course, for the reference model as well, which so many of us use. And if you're not using it, please do use it because it's a tremendous tool and resource. So if you're not already involved with the TMF group, or you haven't had an opportunity to go on their website, I would thoroughly encourage you to do that. That's a really great resource. And I know here at Axiom, we definitely follow their guidance. It's the thing that really is our industry standard at play for TMF at the moment, and documentation in general. So we're very heavily influenced by following their guidance.
And I'll add a couple of extra resources to that, especially when we're talking about technology. Then we have the project teams working closely to ensure that there's that translation. That translation's happening from the TMF plan into the technology, as well as the ongoing support. We also have our Axiom customer care, which is our 24/7 support. And they're not just on the tech side, they're also able to comment to the specifics of the study. So that's helpful with all of the modules, the ones that we noted, as well as the eTMF, of course. And then our final one, which we definitely can't get away from, is that TMF plan. Making sure you have the documentation around what reference model you're using. You have your map that lays out all of the pieces, including your milestones, when those documents are coming in, what documents are coming in, and from who, identifying all of your contributors there. I just want to go back to the poll as I was peeking at it again. As I did note, we had some new voters come in. And so we don't have our 100%, so we definitely want to be working towards that, but we do have some votes there that they don't have that yet in their SOPs. Hopefully your CROs or vendors are providing that to you, and or it's something in the works. Just going back to what we talked about earlier, it's really important to get that buy-in from your upper management, from the teams that are doing the work, so that you can make sure that you have that understanding of the importance, and then you also have the final delivery, which is, of course, or that result, which is a nice, clean, up-to-date eTMF, not just at the end of the study, but all the way through.
And you should have it at the start, but it's never too late to put a plan in place.
That's a great point as well. So for those of you that don't have one, then you have your homework set out there too. Okay. Well, on that note, and that wraps up our QA. Thank you so much for your time today and for your contributions there. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Heather.